The sun beat down on the cracked, parched earth of Elias Johnson's failing homestead like a relentless hammer. For 3 years, the rains had forsaken the land, turning what was once modestly productive into a dust bowl. Crops withered before they could sprout. The few scrawny chickens stopped laying, and the milk cow had been sold for seed that never yielded. Debt clung to Elias like a shroud, a heavy, suffocating presence, embodied by the cold-eyed men from the bank in Silver Creek, who visited monthly, their patience thinner than the topsoil. His wife Martha wasted away from worry and scarce rations, her eyes hollow mirrors of despair. And then there was Alara, his daughter, 18 summers old, her spirit as vibrant as the wildflowers that used to fringe their property. Now dimmed by hardship, she worked tirelessly, her hands raw from digging for water that wasn't there, her back bent over futile attempts to coax life from the sterile ground. Elias watched her, a gnawing guilt twisting his gut. He saw the hunger in her eyes, the resignation replacing her youthful hope. The bank's final notice, delivered by a man whose smirk held no pity, demanded payment in full by month's end, or they would seize everything, leaving them destitute. It was then, in the crushing silence of their meager cabin, the smell of dust and defeat thick in the air, that the unthinkable solution took root, a poison fruit born of utter desperation. Silas Blackwood, a man whose name was whispered with fear in the saloons and shanties of the territory, had made an offer weeks ago, an offer Elias had recoiled from then. Now, with the walls closing in and his family facing starvation or worse, that offer seemed like the only rope left to clutch, however frayed and vile it felt. Silas Blackwood wasn't merely wealthy. He was a force of nature, carved from granite and bitterness. His sprawling ranch, the Barbie, stretched across miles of the harshest, most unforgiving land, yet he thrived where others perished. He did it through ruthless efficiency, an iron will, and a reputation for brooding, violence that kept hired hands in line and neighbors at a distance. He was a widower, his wife having died under mysterious circumstances years ago, leaving him alone in his vast cold mansion. He needed more than just ranch hands. He needed someone to manage his household, someone to cook, clean, and tend to his sprawling, empty home with the same relentless discipline he applied to his cattle. He needed a wife, not for companionship, but for control. When he'd laid eyes on Alara Johnson in town, fetching supplies for her father, he'd seen not the weary girl, but the spark of life in her eyes and the strong line of her jaw. He saw a challenge, something to break and mold. He approached Elias, not with warmth, but with the cold calculation of a man buying livestock. "Your girl," he'd stated, not asked, outside the general store. "She's strong, healthy. I'll take her off your hands, clear your debts with the bank, give you enough to start fresh somewhere else." The price he named was staggering, enough to erase every worry Elias had ever known. Elias had refused, horrified, but Silas merely smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of his lips. "Think on it, Johnson," he'd drawled before riding away. Now, with the bank's deadline looming like a hangman's noose, Elias found himself riding to the Barbie, the weight of his decision crushing his spirit. He negotiated the sale, not as a father, but as a desperate merchant, haggling over the life of his child. The final agreement, sealed with a handshake that felt like signing his own soul away. Silas counted out the gold coins onto the scarred wooden table in his study, the clinking sound echoing like a death knell in Elias's ears. Alara learned of her fate not from her father's lips, but from the sight of him returning home, his face ashen and his eyes unable to meet hers. He carried a heavy leather pouch that clinked with an unfamiliar, ominous sound. Her mother, Martha, wept silently, her body shaking with silent sobs as she clutched a worn shawl. "It's done, Ilara," Elias whispered, his voice rough with shame. "Mr. Blackwood, he's paid our debts. He's taken care of everything." The words hung in the stifling air of the cabin, thick and poisonous. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face, a cold dread washing over her. "Taken care of everything? What do you mean, Pa?" she asked, though a part of her already knew. A part of her screamed in denial. Elias couldn't look at her. He stared at the packed saddlebags near the door. A few changes of clothes, for Mother's precious locket. "You're to go with him, Ilara, to the Barbie. You'll be his wife, and his house. It's the only way, girl, the only way to save this place, to save your ma." The reality crashed down on her with the force of a stampeding bull, sold like a horse, like a sack of grain. Her own father, broken by hardship, had traded her life, her future, for gold and a reprieve from debt. Anger warred with terror in her chest. She looked at her mother's tear-streaked face, her father's hunched, defeated posture, and saw the utter desolation they were drowning in. There was no fight left in them, only the grim acceptance of survival at any cost. Her own survival was the price. A numbness settled over her, a protective shell against the unbearable pain. She didn't scream, she didn't plead. She simply stood up, walked to her small cot, and began mechanically folding her meager belongings into the saddlebags. Each movement a silent testament to the death of her dreams. Silas Blackwood arrived at the Johnson homestead 2 days later, just as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of blood and ash. He rode a massive black stallion, an animal as imposing and ill-tempered as its master. He dismounted with a fluid, predatory grace, his spurs jingling sharply in the sudden silence that fell over the small farmstead. He wore expensive dust-covered buckskins, a wide-brimmed hat, shadowing a face etched with harsh lines, and eyes the color of flint, cold, hard, and utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't acknowledge Elias or Martha, who stood trembling on the porch. His gaze locked onto Ilara, who stood beside her meager belongings, her back straight but her face pale. He circled her, slowly, like a wolf assessing prey, his eyes raking over her from head to toe, noting the worn dress, the calloused hands, the set of her jaw. "See do," he stated flatly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. It wasn't a compliment. It was a judgment of utility. He turned to Elias. "The papers are signed. The bank's been paid. Your gold's spent, I assume." Elias could only nod mutely. Silas grunted. "Good. Get her things loaded." He snapped his fingers, and a silent, burly ranch hand emerged from behind the barn, grabbing Ilara's saddlebags and tossing them unceremoniously onto a pack mule. Silas turned back to Ilara. "You belong to me now, girl. Understand. Your life is mine. Your work is mine. Your will is mine. You step out of line, you'll regret it. You do exactly as I say, when I say it. No questions, no hesitation. Is that clear?" His voice was low, but it carried the unmistakable threat of violence. Ilara met his gaze, forcing herself not to flinch. She gave a single, curt nod, the movement stiff with defiance she couldn't entirely suppress. A flicker of something dangerous sparked in his flinty eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Mount up," he commanded, gesturing towards a sturdy, plain-looking mare he'd brought for her. The finality in his tone was absolute. There were no goodbyes, only the crushing weight of her new reality as she swung herself into the saddle, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The journey to the Barbie Ranch was an ordeal in itself. a brutal introduction to Silas Blackwood's world. They rode for hours, across a desolate landscape of sun-baked plains and jagged rock formations, the relentless sun beating down without mercy. Silas set a punishing pace, rarely speaking, his focus entirely on the trail ahead. Ilara struggled to keep up, unused to such a long, hard ride on unfamiliar terrain. Every jolt of the mare sent pain through her already weary body. The ranch hand, a hulking man named Jed, who communicated only in grunts, rode behind her, ensuring she didn't falter or stray. Silas offered no water, no rest, no word of encouragement. He treated her like another piece of equipment, expected to function without complaint. As they finally crested a ridge late in the second day, the Barbies spread out below them, a vast, intimidating complex of weathered barns, corrals, teeming with cattle, and, dominating it all, a large, two-story house built of dark timber and stone. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, imposing and smoke curled from a single chimney, the only sign of life. They rode down into the yard, the sound of their arrival causing a few wary dogs to bark and a handful of cowhands to stop their work, watching the new arrival with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. Silas dismounted, his spurs crunching on the hard-packed dirt. "Jed, see to the horses," he barked. "Phew," he said, pointing a thick finger at Ilara. "Get inside. The kitchen's through there. You'll find stew on the stove. Serve it. Then you'll start learning your duties. I expect my supper at 6 sharp. Don't be late." He turned and strode towards the house without a backward glance, leaving Ilara standing alone in the dusty yard, the weight of 100 hostile or pitying eyes upon her, feeling more isolated and terrified than ever before. The sheer scale of the place, the coldness of the man who owned her, and the sheer impossibility of her situation settled over her like a shroud. Ilara's new life at the Barbie was a relentless cycle of grueling labor and crushing isolation, dictated by Silas Blackwood's inflexible rules. For days began before dawn, long before the sun touched the horizon. She was expected to have the massive kitchen fire stoked, coffee brewing, and a simple breakfast of biscuits and salt pork ready for Silas and the few hands who ate at the main house. Then came the endless chores, scrubbing the huge, cold stone floors of the cavernous house until her knuckles bled. Laundering, Silas's heavy soiled work, clothed by hand in icy water, beating dust from thick drapes that hadn't seen sunlight in years, preparing elaborate meals for a man who barely tasted them, only to clear away the untouched portions later. Silas demanded perfection, a speck of dust on a mantelpiece, a slightly undercooked biscuit, a pot not scoured bright enough. Any perceived failing earned her a sharp, cutting reprimand, his voice like a whip crack in the oppressive silence of the house. He never raised a hand to her, not at first, but the threat was always there, simmering in his eyes, implied in the tense set of his shoulders. He watched her constantly, his presence a suffocating weight. He criticized her posture, her pace, the way she spoke, which was rarely, and only when directly questioned. He controlled every aspect. What she wore, drab, shapeless dresses, he provided. When she ate scraps after he was finished, where she slept, a tiny, windowless room off the kitchen, little more than a closet. The only other people she saw were the silent, wary ranch hands who avoided her eyes, and Jed, who delivered supplies and grunted instructions. Loneliness was a constant companion, deeper and more profound than any she had known on the failing homestead. There, at least, she had had her parents. however broken. Here, she was utterly alone, a prisoner in a gilded cage, her spirit slowly being ground down by the sheer, unrelenting harshness of her existence and the cold, demanding tyranny of the man who owned her. Weeks bled into months, marked only by the changing seasons and the deepening lines of fatigue on Ellora's face. The initial numbness gave way to a simmering resentment, a tiny, defiant spark that refused to be entirely extinguished. One evening, after a particularly grueling day spent scrubbing the immense hearth until her arms felt like lead, Silas returned from a long ride in a foul temper. He slammed the door, stalked into the dining room, and threw his hat onto the table with a violence that made Ellara flinch. "Supper now," he growled, not even looking at her. She hurried to serve the beef stew she'd kept warm, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the bowl before him. A drop of broth splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. It was a tiny accident, barely noticeable, but Silas's eyes snapped to it, then to her face. "Clumsy," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Can't you do anything right? That cloth was cleaned this morning. You'll scrub it again tonight, by hand. After everything else, the injustice of it, the sheer pettiness over a minuscule stain after all her back-breaking work, ignited the spark within her. Exhaustion and frustration overwhelmed her usual caution. "It was an accident, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, but laced with a defiance she couldn't hide. "I've been working since before dawn. The cloth can be—" She didn't finish. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He loomed over her, his face contorted with rage, his eyes blazing. "You dare talk back," he roared, the sound echoing through the silent house. "You forget your place, girl. You belong to me. You speak when spoken to, and you obey without question. That accident is just another sign of your laziness, your ingratitude." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, his hand raised slightly, not quite striking, but the threat palpable. Ellara stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs, the taste of fear sharp in her mouth, but beneath it, a fierce, stubborn anger burned. She had spoken the truth, and for a fleeting second she felt a flicker of her own spirit, unbroken. The aftermath of her defiance was swift and brutal. Silas didn't strike her, but his punishment was designed to break her spirit far more effectively than a blow could. "Since you have so much energy to argue," he snarled, his face still flushed with anger, "you'll find better uses for it tonight. Forget the tablecloth. The root cellar needs cleaning. Every crate, every shelf, every corner. Scrub it with lye soap and water until it shines. And you'll do it now, without supper. We'll stay down there until it's done to my satisfaction. Tomorrow," he grabbed a lantern from the wall, thrust it into her hands, and practically dragged her towards the heavy, wooden door leading down to the root cellar. The air that rose to meet her was damp, cold, and smelled of earth and decay. "Get in," he ordered, shoving her none too gently towards the steep, narrow stairs. "And don't come out until I send for you." He slammed the door shut, and she heard the heavy iron bolt slide home with a final, chilling thud. The sound echoed in the sudden, oppressive darkness, broken only by the sputtering light of the lantern she clutched. The cellar was vast, cold, and shadowed, filled with shelves of preserves, sacks of potatoes and onions, and hanging strings of dried herbs. It was also filthy, with dirt and grime caked into every corner. The lye soap burned her hands as she scrubbed the cold seeping into her bones. Hours passed in the flickering lamplight, the only sounds the scrape of her brush, the drip of water, and the frantic beating of her own heart. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Fatigue made her limbs tremble, but the crushing weight of her isolation and the injustice of her punishment were far heavier. She thought of her parents, of the sun on her face, of freedom, and tears of anger and despair mingled with the soapy water on the cold stone floor. She scrubbed until her hands were raw and bleeding, until the lantern oil ran low, until sheer exhaustion forced her to collapse onto a pile of empty sacks. Shivering in the damp darkness, the spark of defiance reduced to a tiny, guttering ember. The bolts scraping back the next morning was the most welcome sound Ilara had ever heard. Silas stood framed in the doorway, the bright morning light behind him, making him look like a dark silhouette. He surveyed the cellar, his gaze sweeping over the now clean shelves and floors. He gave a curt, grudging nod. "Acceptable," he grunted. "Get up to the kitchen. Start breakfast. And remember this lesson." He turned and left without another word. Ilara stumbled up the stairs, blinking in the sunlight, her body aching, her hands throbbing. She moved like an automaton through the motions of starting the fire and preparing biscuits. As she worked, a young ranch hand named Tom, who usually avoided her, slipped quietly into the kitchen. He was barely older than she was, his face kind but etched with the hardship of ranch life. He placed a small cloth-wrapped bundle on the table near her. "Here," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "Saw you didn't get supper last night. It's just bread and cheese and ... some salve for your hands." Before she could react, he was gone, melting back into the yard. Ilara stared at the bundle, then slowly unwrapped it. The simple food smelled like heaven. The salve was a small tin of pungent grease. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they weren't just of despair. They were tears of gratitude, of shock at this unexpected kindness in a place defined by cruelty. It was a tiny act, probably dangerous for Tom if Silas found out, but it was a lifeline. It reminded her that not everyone in this harsh world was like Silas Blackwood. It reminded her that she was still human, still worthy of compassion. As she ate the bread and cheese, savoring each bite, and carefully rubbed the cooling salve into her raw, burning hands, the tiny ember of defiance inside her flickered again, fed by this small, crucial connection. It wasn't freedom, but it was a crack in the walls of her prison, a whisper of hope in the suffocating silence. Life, at the Barbie, settled back into its harsh rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted within Ilara. Memory of Tom's kindness, the salve that soothed her hands, the taste of bread given freely became a secret anchor. She learned to navigate Silas's tyranny with a new, cautious strategy. She performed her duties with meticulous efficiency, leaving no room for criticism, for movements, precise and economical. She became a ghost in the vast house, silent, observant, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. Her face, a mask of passive obedience. She spoke only when necessary, her voice low and devoid of inflection. Silas, for his part, seemed to interpret this change as the breaking he had sought. He became slightly less volatile, though no less demanding or watchful. The punishments ceased, replaced by a cold, expectant silence. But beneath the surface of her compliance, Ilara's mind was constantly working. She listened to the ranch hands' conversations when they thought she wasn't near, piecing together news of the outside world. The price of cattle, the comings and goings in Silver Creek, the rumors of homesteaders moving further west. She observed the routines of the ranch, the layout of the land, the times when Silas was away on long rides. The spark of defiance, nurtured by Tom's fleeting act of compassion, had not died. It had transformed. It was no longer a fiery impulse, but a steady, burning coal of resolve. She endured the loneliness, the back-breaking work, the constant oppressive presence of her owner, But she endured with a purpose. She began to hoard small things. A few coins left carelessly on a table, a piece of sturdy twine, a scrap of paper. She watched the horizon, not just with longing, but with calculation. The Barbie was her prison, and Silas Blackwood her jailer. But Alara Johnson, the girl sold for gold, was learning the walls. She was learning the routines. She was biding her time, waiting for the moment, however distant, when the ember inside her would ignite into the flame of freedom. The Old West was a land of harsh realities, but it was also a land where resilience could be forged in the hottest fires, and hope, however tenuous, could find purchase in the most barren soil. Her story wasn't over. It was merely entering its most dangerous chapter.